Good morning. Hey, everybody. Welcome back. There's a few minutes until 10 a.m., so I'm just hanging out, arriving a little early and waiting for you guys to show up. But hope you're having a great day whenever and wherever you are. And yeah, just sit tight. We got about 7 minutes, and then we will get things going. Okay. Cool. Welcome to class, everyone that's showing up. I know it's still a few minutes till class time, but good to see you, and hope you're having a good morning. Hey there, how's it going? Good to see you. Still about 4.5 minutes. No rush, just waiting for 10 a.m. Hey Leo, good to see you there. Good morning. Okay, right around 4 minutes. Just get comfortable, get your viewing set up the way you liked it. Hey Naaman, good morning. Eddie. Hi Mia. Eddie. Eddie. Trying to get my cat, the other one that you haven't seen, come up. Hey Eddie, big boy. He's like right down there, but he's being a little shy. Hey there, Jesus, Gloria, good to see everyone. About 3 minutes and we'll get started. Eddie. You want to come up here? Come on. Yeah, Big Eddie. Okay, you guys are seeing the big boy, the brother of Peach. Big Princess Peach, and then there's Eddie here. Hi, Eddie. Good boy. It's a lot bigger, but they're the same, 10 months old. Look at this nice white belly he's got. I mean, I think it's like such a cool coloration. Eddie's like the ultimate, like just floppy, sloppy, big kitty. Such a good cat, though. Hey, Eddie. These cats are just too cute. Sorry, I'm going to have to constantly let you guys know. Good morning, everyone. Eddie. He's the silliest cat, really. Splat. Just makes me laugh all the time. I don't know. He's a goofy kitty. What's up, Betty? What's going on? What's up, bro? Morning, guys. Okay, just another minute and then it'll be 10. We'll get things started. Come on, baby. No. Good morning. Hi there. Hi, Angel, Kobe, Ivan, Mark, Melanie, Jerry, Jocelyn. Good to see everybody. Good morning. Yeah, well, I'm going to get a lot of the cat content. I mean, they're pretty obsessed with me, so they're always around. Okay, guys. Well, good morning. Welcome back. It's now 10, so I'm going to let us get started. As you can see, cats are hanging out for the moment. I'll have to move them eventually, but for the time being, welcome back. So I hope you're having a great first week and that everything's been going smooth with all your classes. Today we're starting in on the first real lecture for our class, where we're going to talk about some of the material in the book. And so we're just starting our big journey into the world of philosophy today, really. First of all, Peachy, come on. Let me put you guys down. Sorry, kitties. Okay, Eddie, go play with your sister, huh? Go over there. All right, guys, yeah. So let me say this. To those that are here attending, could you just do this for the whole attendance thing? Like, if you haven't tapped into the chat to just put a comment, then just use the chat now, and the live chat remains permanently archived on the video that stays up on the channel. So I'm going to use that to basically go back and check on attendance if I ever need to. So if there's anybody here who didn't quite say anything yet, then you can say good morning, hello, or present, or here, or anything at all, and then that'll be your record of attendance for today. Here's the thing also I would like to let you know. Sometimes people will have a YouTube username that's different from their real name, which is fine. But if your YouTube username doesn't show me your name that's in the roster, then go ahead and write the name, like Agent Seb, for example. You'd want to show me your name in the comment that you type so that I can make sure to give you your credit, or, well, it's not credit, but that I can make sure who it is that was present and was attending. So if you have your real name used as a username, no problem. Otherwise, just say, okay, good, thanks, Sebastian. Okay, perfect. So we're all together, and we're going to start on philosophy now. So I hope you guys are well. If there's ever anything that you need, you have any questions or comments or reactions to anything that we're doing, feel free to use this live chat. I see it, and I see your comment in real time, and I'll react to it and respond to whatever you may have. So that's the way we're going to run these meetings. This is YouTube Live, and we're going to use this platform throughout the semester for almost all the meetings. So I did send a friendly reminder just before class time today to make sure that we had the maximum attendance and everyone knew where to go. But for the most part, going forward, I just expect that you'll find this meeting on your own. You simply have to go to my YouTube channel at 10 a.m. on Tuesday and Thursday, and this is going to be happening live, so you'll be able to watch, no problem. Yeah, good to know, and hopefully that makes clear sense. If anything I'm saying is unclear, you need me to repeat anything, just definitely feel free to jump in. Okay, so the first topic in our course is religion and belief. Did we talk about the meaning of the word philosophy last time at all? I don't think we got into it too much. So let me start just by mentioning that the word philosophy, because this is introduction to philosophy, we kind of want to, I think, have a base understanding of what that word means. Have any of you guys ever heard? Thanks, Jason. Yeah, and do subscribe. Yeah, if you subscribe, you'll get notifications that come automatically whenever the class is in session, and that helps you stay a little more in touch with the class. So I would advise doing that if you want. So back to what I was asking here, philosophy. Does anybody have any general knowledge of how that word is interpreted if you break it down into its roots? What do you think? Do you know or not? Anybody have even a guess? If you don't know, that's fine. Just let me know that you don't know, and then I'll explain. But sometimes I like to do that. I like to see if there's already some level of knowledge that came to you from some source, and then I can expand on it. But maybe philo means love, right? Exactly, Brandon. That comes from the Greek word, so philia. Philosophy, the word itself, is derived from two roots, and they're both Greek. So one of the two parts of it is the word philia, which means to love. Like, so if you've ever heard of like a bibliophile, a lover of books, audiophile, lover of sound, cinephile, lover of cinema and film, right? So phile. And that's the first part of the word philosophy. The second part, Sophie, comes from the Greek word Sophia, which is oftentimes just a nice name nowadays. But yeah, that's correct, Jason and others. Sophia just means in Greek wisdom. So what you're learning then is that the word philosophy overall, if you study its origins in Greek, means to love wisdom or the love of wisdom. And a philosopher, a person who practices philosophy or does it, would be one who loves wisdom. So it's actually like the forefather of all the other academic disciplines. They all branched off from philosophy, their original ancestor. If you go way back into the Western world, you see that the first institution of higher learning in the West that's kind of like comparable to our modern day university system was Plato's Academy. And this is 2,000 years ago. Plato, the ancient Greek, founded Plato's Academy. And at the academy, everyone was just studying philosophy. Philosophy was considered to be such a broad range of the pursuit of wisdom that it kind of covered everything that we talk about as academic sub-disciplines today. So like science, math, history, literature are all things that branched off of the original like master discipline of everything, which was philosophy. So it has a very deep and rich tradition, and it goes back thousands of years. But it is the love of wisdom. I find that interesting because a lot of other academic subjects, they have the word logos built into them, like biology or whatever is like the logic of life or biologically living life forms. But philosophy is one of the only disciplines, I think, that has love built into the statement of its definition. So lying right at the core of philosophy is some kind of passion and a love, a pursuit for wisdom that you do out of love, which makes it, I think, unique also among the academic field of subjects. So philosophers try to pursue questions of deep human significance to the human condition in every area of life and every aspect of reality. So there are many different things that philosophers can and do talk about, and we're going to take a tour through this class on all the major topics, or at least many of them that I think are quite interesting. Sometimes philosophers are interested in the question, does God exist, and what's the nature of religion, and can we evaluate religious claims and arguments for and against God's existence? Sometimes people are interested in the question, how do we know things, and what is knowledge? Sometimes it's about right and wrong. What's the nature of morality? Sometimes it's consciousness. How do we have the ability to even think and perceive? And sometimes it's about things like time. How does time work? Or what's the value of life? And what does it mean to be a human being that lives and dies? So all these really deep and fundamental questions that concern us as people are the subject matter of philosophical investigation, and it goes back thousands of years. We're going to look at many of the main topics in philosophy, and we're going to start with philosophy of religion. So that's our first big topic. Okay, so now, philosophy has a breakdown of subcategories and specializations. Just like in science, if you're a person like a major in a science major, you don't just say, I'm majoring in science. You know, you have a more precise subfield within science, like, oh, my major is biology or chemistry or physics or like, I don't know, geology, right? The same is true of philosophy. There are subdomains of philosophy. So one of them is philosophy of religion, and that's going to be the first branch of philosophy that we are going to study for like 3 or 4 weeks starting the class. Now, in the philosophy of religion, we ask questions like these. What are arguments for God's existence? What are arguments that try to show the non-existence of God? What's the nature of religious belief? And how can we clarify and expand on these beliefs through argument? One of the big questions, obviously, within the philosophy of religion is the debate over the existence of God. And so we're going to basically spend a few weeks now looking at and trying to understand some of the most famous and powerful arguments in history for God's existence. And also we're going to learn about what are the objections to what are the criticisms against those arguments. Philosophy has some similarities to the practice of law in the sense that in a court, you have attorneys on both sides arguing opposite claims. Like one person's arguing guilt, the opposing attorney is arguing innocence. In philosophy, we are also considering claims on both sides, but it's not necessarily concerning legal questions, but rather big, heady questions about life and reality. Like, does God exist? Here's one argument presented professionally and academically that he does, and here's a counter argument to that. So your job as the student is to read these essays in the book and come away with a clear understanding that you could articulate and report on as to what these arguments were. So you kind of have to become the master of the philosopher's arguments. You have to be able to present them and discuss them with others and also be able to showcase your knowledge of them in your writing, but that comes a little later. So let's get started. There are 3 main positions on the question of God's existence that people can take. So let me talk about those first. Let me say this, on the existence of God. Okay, so one big category of people are theists. Contrary to that, there are atheists. And then there's also, some say, a third possible category of agnostics. So first of all, let's talk about the theists. Maybe you've heard this word and you have a sense, even if it's a guess, of what it means. So let's see if you can think about that. What do you believe? What is a theist? What is the definition of some person who's a theist? What defines theism or being a theist, if you had to guess? What do you think about that? Theist. Who or what type of person? Okay, good, very good, yes. Janice and Brandon, people that believe, well, not in a religion, yes, but to be more precise, it's someone that believes that God exists, okay? Believes that God exists. So these are people who believe that God exists. Okay, those that believe that God exists are theists. And defined in this general way, theism is a position that can span across different religious traditions. So like Christians are theists, Jews, Muslims, etc., are theists, because even if their belief about the doctrines and revelations of God are slightly different, they all agree that something called God exists. Okay, so theism is just the position that there is a God and the belief that God's real. But it's not the only view, of course, even if it's the predominant view of most people. I think if you look around the globe, just statistically or demographically speaking, it's a significant majority of the global population that is some manner, not 100%. So some are on the other side, atheists. What is an atheist, if anyone thinks they know? What does it mean for a person to be identified as an atheist? Okay, good. It's those that do not believe in the existence of God. Correct. So okay, so some people are not believers. Some people think there's no God, or that the idea of God is just like false, or somehow a projection of human hopes or dreams. But of course, there are some people that don't believe. I think in the United States, it's a small but growing share of the population. It's a significant minority, but I've heard that there seems to be a growth globally in atheism overall, especially in the West. Nonetheless, I think it's something like 70% plus Christian identification in the U.S., and then you have the assortment of other world religions, and then it's like 10% or a little more than that that self-identify as atheists. Nonetheless, we have to consider arguments on all sides. And then third, sometimes people mention a third possibility, agnostics. Anybody have a vague idea of that concept? Who or what an agnostic thinks or doesn't think? Maybe that one's not as clear or familiar to us. You say hybrid. That's one way to put it, I guess. Janice, you say people who believe that there is God, not enough evidence. Very good, yeah. Good, and also correct, Jason. So perfect. This is kind of like the middle ground, intermediate position between the other two opposites. So the agnostics neither confirm nor deny. Like they neither say believe nor disbelieve. They basically say, I'm going to withhold judgment. I'm not going to judge whether God exists or not, because basically they say they don't know. They think there's not good enough evidence to prove or to disprove. Okay, so agnostics. Suspends judgment. Meaning they don't take a pro or con, affirmative or negative position. They suspend judgment. Why? Because of perceived lack of evidence. So from the point of view of an agnostic, the evidence is inconclusive, and it's not enough to firmly conclude that God does or doesn't exist. Now, I've heard some people say that they don't agree that agnosticism is a genuine third category. I've heard it sometimes argued that anything other than saying you believe in God is just some version of atheism. So some people believe that agnosticism is just yet another variation on the overall idea of atheism, and that there's really just two positions. You either believe in God or you don't. But I think that it is a little bit better and perhaps rational to have this middle ground category, because it's like believers, non-believers, and the undecided pretty much. But if you follow those other critical arguments, then you might disagree that this is a legitimate third category. Anyway, I put it on the table for you to think of. Now, what we're going to do from here then is this. We're going to try and investigate the best, heavy-hitting arguments from people on all different sides of this debate. And we're going to look through the whole span of Western history to try and decode and discover what are the most powerful, long-standing arguments from theism that make the case for God's existence. What best arguments can they offer us? And, what are the criticisms that come from people on the other side? Our job in this class is not to, let's say, agree with one or another position, but merely to understand the various positions so that you know where everyone's coming from and you know how they formulate their beliefs. And so we're going to always have balance in this class. There's always going to be every side that's given voice. I'm just a neutral arbiter of these arguments who tries to present them to you in a clear and direct way, but understand that no matter what you believe, you're going to hear some arguments in this class that are contrary to your beliefs, because we hear arguments that say God exists, that God doesn't exist, and everything in between. And it's like that throughout the whole semester. It's like, in law, a lawyer doesn't go up and make an argument unchallenged by an opposing attorney. And so in philosophy and in life, we have to deal with competing arguments and counter arguments. So you have to become a person who can express and explain them. But we're going to start then with some big arguments for God's existence. And today, the main lesson is to study one of the most famous ones that goes back 1,000 years. So that's where we're going to go now. I'm going to erase this. And let's jump into our first essay from the book on the topic of the philosophy of religion. This is a piece of writing by a man named Saint Anselm. And the argument for God's existence that he states in this piece of writing is called the ontological argument. The ontological argument from Saint Anselm. Now, I'll give you a little bit of background into the life of Mr. Saint Anselm. So this is a medieval church scholar, and actually he was the Archbishop of Canterbury, so he held an important government position during the time that he lived, and he was a well-known learned figure and scholar. Well, he lived from 1033 till 1109. So that's around, he was born almost 1,000 years ago. It's today 2021, so we're talking about 1033. So right around 1,000 years ago over in Europe, St. Anselm was the Archbishop of Canterbury. And he wrote a book in the year 1077, and that book is called the Proslogion. It's kind of a weird word that is Latin, I believe, but we don't need to know about its meaning. That's the title of the book, the Proslogion, and it comes from 1077. That book contains this argument that we're now going to study and kind of unpack. So if you wanted to go back to the original source, you'd find St. Anselm's Proslogion from 1077. And in that book, yes, there's the ontological argument, attempting to prove the existence of God. By the way, you see his title, Saint Anselm. He was canonized as a saint in the Christian church after his life because of the massive impact that his writings and teachings had on society. This is way before the breakdown of the church into Protestantism and Catholicism. William, you say you had a little bit of a blur. Let me just pause for a moment and ask to the group if it's okay on your end. Yeah, sometimes individual students will have a data connection issue that sometimes can cause the speed of the lecture to get interrupted a little, but it's not always every student, right? So it seems like maybe, Jerry, you have like a little perhaps connection issue on your end, but don't worry. I would say this to anybody who sees the screen get blurry for a moment or loses connection for a moment. The full lecture is recorded. It's also uploaded to the YouTube channel, and it stays up, so you can clearly go back and watch any passage or portion that got temporarily disconnected. Also, here are some technical solutions that students mentioned, which I think also work. Sometimes if you close the stream and then come back to it, you'll find that your computer will sync up with it better. And a worst case scenario, you can also turn on a mobile hotspot with your cell phone as a substitute for Wi-Fi, because sometimes that is a more reliable connection. Okay, and then you have also some other suggestions, including from Ivan, to reduce the resolution on your screen. So all those are good ways to navigate little troubleshooting issues. They'll pop up from time to time, but nothing to stop us, okay? So as I was saying, he was canonized as a saint after his life was over. The Protestant Reformation, which caused the schism in the church between Catholicism and Protestantism, that didn't happen until centuries later. So at the time he lived, he was just in the Christian church as a saint. But now the lineage of saints is more associated with the Catholic denomination. Anyway, let's go into it. What is the ontological argument? So this is an argument that tries to prove that God exists. First point that I want to make about this argument is that it's not based on empirical evidence. Okay, so that's a point to know. Not based on empirical evidence. So let's just see if anyone has a sense of the terms empirical evidence. If I say I have empirical evidence for something, what kind of evidence is that, do you think? What kind of evidence is empirical evidence? Because again, this is an argument that is not based. It's not based on empirical evidence. But let's understand what it is. Okay, Brandon, you say measurable. Good. Janice, you say solid and fact-based. Sort of. Even though that's a little more of a broad description, that's not incorrect. So let me add to that, unless anyone else has some other suggestions. But those are along the right lines, getting started. Empirical evidence. Okay, good. Like a physical experiment. That's also along the right lines, Sergio. Based on observation. And that's very, very precise and clear, Kobe. So yeah, empirical evidence is evidence that you can observe with the five senses. So it's sometimes called physical evidence. In other words, the five senses: sight, taste, touch, hearing, and smell. If it's evidence that you can perceive by those five senses, then that's empirical evidence, okay? Like, for example, is there any evidence that dinosaurs existed? Because they're not alive today. So what's the evidence that they existed? If you could tell me that, just to get an example. That's why I'm asking you this. So what's the evidence for dinosaurs having existed? I think we all know, but I just want to see you say it. It's the fossils, correct. It's not like we're just in a guessing game. Maybe they were out there. No, we've really recovered these physical bones and the skeletons of the dinosaurs, which give clear evidence that they existed, and we can carbon date them and know how old they are and all of that. So that is physical evidence. You know, if you want to have evidence for the existence of dinosaurs, go to a museum, look at the skeleton. There is empirical evidence. But this argument, the ontological argument, it's not based on anything that you could see, taste, touch, hear, or smell. So it's not based on the five senses or anything physical or observable. It's not like he says, here's my argument that God exists. I went, you know, somewhere and I found this piece of fabric, and if you look at it under a microscope, you're going to see like the signature of God. That no, it's not based on anything physical or observable. Instead, it's based on logic and reason alone. So he says it's entirely just based on concepts and logic. It's not based on anything physical or observable. That doesn't mean that it's a bad argument. It just means that it's a conceptual argument. It's one that takes into account only ideas, definitions, and reason. Okay, so just setting the stage, we're now going to learn about his argument, and I just wanted to start with this preface that it is not based on any type of empirical evidence. Okay, so how does this man make the exact argument that God exists? So his first move in presenting this argument in the book is to establish with the reader what kind of being is God believed to be. Like, what's the overall general idea that people have in their head of this concept, God? So I would ask you guys that, if you could. What do you think, when you think of the word God, what like characteristics or attributes would you find describe the being of God? Whether you believe in God or not, how would you define the traits of this being? Like, what is God supposed to have going on? Okay, good. So we're getting started with some very good examples here. Kobe, you say omnipotent. So let me list this on the board as like attributes of God. One of them is what you said, Kobe, omnipotent. Since you use the term, you must know its meaning. What does the word omnipotent mean? It means all-powerful, having infinite, unlimited power. So that's all-powerful. Okay, so like potent has to do with power. Omni means all or everything. So this is all-powerful. And that is one of the associated attributes of God. When we think of God, we think of a being that is utterly infinite with power. So God could make anything happen merely through his will. There's nothing that God is unable to do. There's no power that he lacks. So that's one of them. But it's not the only one. And now we move to the next. I see, Naaman, you're putting on omniscient. Very good, yes. That's another of the big four, I would say, attributes. So what does omniscient mean? Omniscient means all-knowing, knowing everything, infinite knowledge, perfect knowledge. Nothing is hidden from God. All is known to him, past, present, future, from the biggest to the smallest. So that's all-knowing. Okay, so like from Latin, the word scientia means knowledge, and that's where the word science derives from. So having all knowledge, that's omniscience. So we've said all-powerful, all-knowing, and Janice, I see above we have another one, and that's important to mention too. It's the concept of being all good, infinitely good, like perfectly good and moral. The word for that in the terminology that's used often is omnibenevolent. So God has, infinite power and knowledge, but he's thought of as not being like neutral on the moral scale, like or far be it evil. God is a good force, a morally righteous and just, divine kind of, divinely just and beneficent. So that's one of the further qualities that's often associated with God. Because he's supposed to be thought of as perfect, he's perfect in all these important ways, in terms of power, knowledge, and beneficence, being good. There's one more that is sometimes mentioned. Oh, Sergio, I see you've put it there, and that's great. So I didn't have to really fish around for it. You seem to understand omnipresent. So omnipresent. As you can, I guess, judge, that means all present. And maybe I can explain that just a bit further. Present everywhere all the time. So like God exists here, there, and everywhere, not just in one place and not others. That's different from me and you, obviously. Like right now I'm in Long Beach. I don't know exactly where you are, but we're not in the same place. And I'm not where you are and you're not where I am. But God, they say, is a different type of being. He's everywhere. He's literally able to observe and perceive and be at all places and also at all times, right? With me and you, we have a lifespan of whatever, like maybe 80 to 100 years. So we didn't live in the 1700s, and I guess we won't live in like the 2300s. But God, they say, is infinite in time and space. So there's no time that he doesn't exist, and there's no place where he isn't present. So add these four things together, and you get a summary statement of the idea of God that he believes is shared with all people. And if you distill this down to like what they all kind of amount to, he says this is what they add up to in the bottom at the end. They basically mean that God is thought of and understood as the greatest conceivable being. So what do you get when you combine having all power, all knowledge, perfectly good, and you're everywhere all the time? He says that adds up to the greatest conceivable being. So that is the overall definition and concept of God that he thinks we will understand when we think of it. When we think of our current understanding of God, we conclude with this, that he's the greatest conceivable being. At least the definition of God is the greatest conceivable being. Now let me make a point about the way he talks and writes, because for a student reading it the first time, it's fair to say that maybe he's a little confusing at points. But once we understand what he means, it's not so bad. So like right here, this is the easiest way to express this definition of God that he thinks is in our mind. The greatest conceivable being. So there's no being that you could consider or think of that's greater than him. Conceivable, meaning what you could think of or even imagine. And so God, having qualities like this, would be the being so great that he's the greatest thing you could ever think of, and you could not think of anything greater. I believe that the phrasing greatest conceivable being is straightforward and clear. But for whatever reason, he oftentimes uses a different way of putting it, which means the same thing, but it sounds confusing. So he says this, and let me clear the board above so I can write it. So just so you understand, when you look at the book and you read the text and the words written there, you're going to see him use this phrase a lot. Instead of greatest conceivable being, he's going to say the being, okay, than which none greater can be conceived. The being than which none greater can be conceived. That's an awkward, perhaps, phrasing, but it just means the same thing as greatest conceivable being. If I say, like, I'm the man on the mountain above which nobody stands, that means that I'm the highest point on the mountain and there's no one above me. So, like, above which, than which, it makes it a comparative, saying that in comparison with this being, all other beings are such that they cannot be conceived of as greater than it. So don't be misled or confused by that turn of phrase. It really just means he's talking about the overall idea of the greatest conceivable being, the being greater than anything you think of. So here's what he says to start the passage, and I'll read it from the book. Okay, in the proslogion, he wrote these words, and in the beginning of our little excerpt from it, he's talking to God, and he says this, from page 15 of the textbook. He says, "Well then, Lord, you who give understanding to faith, grant me that I may understand as much as you see fit that you exist as we believe you to exist, and that you are what we believe you to be. Now, we believe that you are something than which nothing greater can be thought. Or can it be that a thing of such nature does not exist, since," and now he quotes from the scripture, the Christian Bible. In the Psalms, it says, "The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God." So he quotes that line. He says, "Or could it be that a thing of such a nature does not exist, since, quote, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God," unquote. Okay, now, but continuing, he says, "But surely when this same fool," now he uses the word fool throughout as like a label for the atheist. That's not really nice, but he says, "But surely when this same fool hears what I am speaking about, namely, something than which nothing greater can be thought, he understands what he hears. And what he understands is in his mind, even if he does not understand that it actually exists." Okay, so now let me pause for a bit and try and break that down with you guys. What he's saying here is the idea and the definition, the understanding we have of God is greatest conceivable being, being than which none greater can be conceived. But what he's really insisting on here is this point, and let me ask it to you as a question. Who do you think has this idea of God in their mind? Namely, the idea of greatest conceivable being. Like, what kind of persons? We've listed earlier in the beginning of the meeting what different positions are concerning God's existence. So among those, who do you think he is saying has the definition in mind, greatest conceivable being? To whom does this definition hold truth? Okay, so theists, you're saying, and that's good, of course. If you're a theist and you believe in God, then yeah, you think God is the greatest conceivable being. What else could you think? That he's got limitations or that he somehow lacks? So that's clear. But, and now this is a little, I don't know if you want to call it a plot twist or something unexpected, but he says it's also not even just the theists, though, that hold this definition of God in their mind. So who do you think he's mentioning then? It's not just the theists, but even who else at least has this definition of God in their head? Because you don't have to be a theist to understand that this is what the word God means by definition. So he's saying it also includes agnostics, but even, I'm really leading you towards it here, it's actually even, who else? Yes, agnostics too. But it's not limited to that either. It's also atheists, correct? Yes, Kobe. It's everybody, he's saying. Because look, if you're an atheist, right, that means you don't think God exists. That means you don't think God is real. But it doesn't mean that you do not understand the definition of the word. Like if a person says, "Do you believe in God?" the atheist doesn't say, "Well, first of all, I have no idea what you're even talking about. What does that word mean?" So he says theists and atheists actually have one point of common ground. They all agree that with respect to the concept, at least, the concept of God is at least the idea of the greatest conceivable being. So then what really separates the theist from the atheist? It's not about the definition they have in mind. It's Kobe, I think you're saying it. The difference is whether they actually believe this being exists, but they do have the same definition. Exactly correct. Yeah. So, like, me and you can both understand the definition of, like, Santa Claus. If like me and like a 5-year-old can both understand the definition, but I think he doesn't exist, and the 5-year-old thinks he does. But you know what I mean? Like, I can see that the definition is like this mythical gift giver that lives in the North Pole. It's just that I don't think that's a real thing. Okay, and so there's many concepts like that. We used to have the idea of like the ether, a medium through which all matter and light had to pass in order to transmit itself from point A to point B. That was a postulate of science in the 19th century, but we know nowadays that it's not true. Nonetheless, when it was being debated whether it was true or false, the two people could have at least agreed on the operational definition of it, and then had disputes about whether that's a fact or not. Okay, so point here to just take in. He starts his essay with a definition of God, greatest conceivable being. And point number 2 is, this is a common definition for all people. It's not only theists, but even atheists at least have that idea in the mind. So from there, we take a next step in the argument. The next step of the argument is to point out that some things exist only in the mind, and they're not in reality. But on the other hand, there are things that exist in both. Okay, so let's try and get a little diagram going so I can explain the point here. Okay, so I've just set up on the board here like a little diagram which has a cross, and on the top left of it we have this heading, things that exist only in the mind. And we're going to fill this quadrant with examples. Over here to the top right, the heading says exists in both the mind and in reality also. And down below we'll show examples of that. But let's start here to the left. Okay, so with all of you guys here, sharp, inquisitive minds, I'm thinking you'll be able to give me some good, clear examples of things that only exist in the mind, but they're not also in reality. So I'm talking about like make-believe things, fictional things, things from like fantasy or film or just literature or whatever that don't actually exist. Okay, well, Sergio, this is a perhaps odd example to begin with, because fear is a phenomenon that you experience, like it's emotional, it's a psychological state. But fear is also something that occurs because of like biochemical actions happening in your brain. So there is like a real physical corollary to the felt experience of fear. I'm thinking more along the lines that I see here below, like, goblins, unicorns, the tooth fairy. Those are all good examples. So these things aren't real, but they're like in the mind at least. You've heard of the tooth fairy. You've heard of the Easter bunny. You've heard of the unicorn, the mythical horse with a horn that's not a real thing. And the list goes on, we could talk about like any of the, characters from the Marvel Comics universe, or like, Leprechaun, pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Yeah, I'm not sure. You guys having a little sidebar about La Llorona? What is that thing? I'm like kind of off. I don't know the reference, so you have to clue me in. But anyways, Luke Skywalker, yeah, and on, Santa Claus, whatever. Even though there was a guy named St. Nicholas, some people think that's the historical predecessor to the legend. But yeah, okay, good. So we got plenty of examples. I don't know, goblins, I put that in there. So goblins, leprechauns, Easter bunny, tooth fairy, etc. Those are things that just only exist in the mind, but they're not real. They're not really out there. They're just like in your head. Over here, though, let's put in some examples of things that they're in the mind, but they're also real. That should be very easy to come up with, because it's just like look around you, like all kinds of stuff. So you give the category of food. Yeah, food is real. It's out there. It's not just a mental figment of your imagination. How about something specific instead of a category? Animals. Okay, there's so many of them, but again, that's a category, which is fine. But yeah, it's true that animals are real in the reality, and they're not just like imaginary things. Non-fictional items. Love. Wait, so Jerry, you're talking about love as something that exists in the mind and reality. Sure, but I'd rather go with objects for the moment because it's kind of a little confusing to talk about what the real existing thing is when we get into like emotional states, even though I'm not disagreeing that they are real. Chairs, sounds, a black t-shirt, yeah, those are all good. How about this though? You guys refuse to give me something specific. You keep giving me examples like the category silverware. No, like how about something that's like a particular thing, just to make sure that we can just derive such an example, like a public object or Corinthian leather chair. Yes, but again, it's a category, Kobe. I need a name of a specific one. 26, again, that's a category, Ivan. There's like a million 2016 Dodge Durangos. Blue mechanical pencil, PS5, Wendy's cup, sushi. Still, there's not one specific thing though. These are all like, there's like 100 million things that are in each of those categories. Give me the name of one thing that stands alone. Joe Biden, good. Thank you. I don't know why you guys both came up with the same thought at the same time, but that's funny. Biden won't always exist though. He's pretty old. How about something that's going to last and be out there for like a long time? Pacific Ocean. Okay, good. You could say Statue of Liberty, Eiffel Tower, White House, and on and on. Dr. Vulich, yeah, here I am live and in person. And I'm not just in your head either. So there's lots of stuff, okay? You, for example, would be another example. The moon, Statue of the good, very good. So we're now, I think, all on the same page. So coming back to this, some things exist only in the mind, stuff like that. Just made up fake stuff, imaginary stuff. But of course, there are many things that you can think about, but they're not just in your head, and they're also out there and they're real outside of your head. Even if you stop thinking about everything because you no longer exist, these would still be out there. So they're external to your mind. Now, the question then is this, from Anselm to you. Which kind of thing between these two options is God? That's really the question between theism and atheism. Is God just a figment of your imagination, something in your head like the tooth fairy or the unicorn? Or is God something that is actually real, and he's not just something you think about, but it's actually external to you, a real objective thing, not just subjective? Well, here's the next step that he's going to take. He says, based on the definition of God, which remind me of it again, what did he say that definition was? He said, we can all agree, even atheists, that definition-wise, God is defined as the what? Tell me that. Because that's the next point. We refer back to the definition yet again of God that he says is common to all. A being that's above all, the greatest conceivable being. Correct? Good. Okay, Sergio. So since God is defined as the greatest conceivable being, he says, that is my leverage point. Since God's definition is greatest conceivable being, and even atheists can concede to that, that means that he actually must exist in both the mind and in reality. Why? Because, simply stated, he believes that it is greater. Well, let me ask you, what do you think would be greater? For a thing to only exist in the mind and not really be real? Or for a thing to exist in the mind and also have reality? What's greater, to just be only in the mind, or in the mind and reality both? One or both? What do you think would be the common sense intuition there? What's it greater to do? To be both in the mind and reality, or only in the mind? Correct, Kobe, Jerry, and the others. It's both. Because it's just more. I mean, that's more existence. Existing in the mind is fine, but if you exist in reality also, then that's extra on top of only existing in the mind. So it's greater. And with the definition that we have of God, it says that he's the greatest conceivable being. So now think about it. If he only existed in the mind, then he would not live up to the definition greatest conceivable being, because that right there would be less great than to exist in both. So he says the definition of God, greatest conceivable being, kind of just locks you in logically to saying that he has to be in both the mind and also be objectively real. Because if not, then that would violate the definition. But he says that definition is uniformly agreed to by all people. So you would contradict yourself if you said the greatest conceivable being is just in your head, because something that's just in your head is to that extent not as great as it could possibly be. So basically, here's the structure of his argument. God is thought to be the greatest conceivable being. Even atheists and theists can agree on that. What they don't agree on is whether he's real or not. But the next point is this. Some things only exist in the mind, and some things exist in both. And here are like some examples of both kinds. But if you think about it, it's greater to exist in both. So given the definition of God, greatest conceivable being, he can't lack for greatness in any way. So therefore, the definition has this implication, that he has to be on this side of this divider. Because if he wasn't, then that wouldn't be the greatest conceivable being, but that's the definition that we already know exists. So that's it. It's really an argument based on the definition of God, and then this secondary point that it's greater to exist in the mind and in reality than to only exist in the mind by itself. If we agree that that's greater, and if we agree that the definition of God is greatest conceivable being, then that means that he would have to have that perfection and greatness included in his full set of attributes. Because lacking existence would be to lack some element of greatness, which if you're the greatest conceivable being, you can't lack for anything. Okay, so William, you say, so he's saying that the only way God does not exist is in those that have not been exposed to him. No, no, no. God exists. Whether a person believes it or not has no bearing on that. Why are you asking this question? You're thinking that if someone hasn't been exposed to the idea of God, he says that everyone has the idea already, that it's just built into the human mind, that we all have the common concept of God. So he would deny your premise. He would say there is no such thing as a person who has not been exposed to the idea of God, because the idea of God is simply the idea of the greatest conceivable being. If you have an idea of greatness and you have an idea of beings, then in your head you're going to come up with the idea of God by yourself, because you're going to think, how great could a being be? Well, it could be as great as possible, and that would be God. Sergio, so he's saying the definition of God is absolute and not subjective. 100% yes. He says the absolute objective definition of God is the greatest conceivable being. But he's not really putting himself out on a limb too far there, because there's no person that says God is like just got limitations. God doesn't live forever. God doesn't know everything. God doesn't have all the power. If you're thinking of something like that, then you're thinking of like, I don't know, like an interdimensional alien or something that has a finite span, but he's not the source of everything. God being unlimited, infinite in all possible ways, he thinks that that is just the same thing as saying greatest conceivable being. And if you're not talking about such a being as that, then you don't understand what the concept of God is. But he thinks we all do. Brandon, couldn't you argue that theists are ones who believe that he is the greatest conceivable being, and atheists acknowledge their belief but do not necessarily see him as great? Well, I don't know. I mean, that's where he would definitely have to, I think, push back on your claim. He would say, look, if you're an atheist, you don't look at the word God and scratch your head and say, well, I can't understand the meaning. You understand the meaning. And if you thought of God as some being that is powerful but not infinitely powerful, then that means you could imagine something even greater. And if you can imagine something greater than the being, then you're not thinking of God yet, because God is the greatest being you can imagine. If you just sort of, I guess, insist on the rejection of that definition, then I guess his argument really could not get started. But it's going to be a hard claim to stand by, that there's some possible way to think of God as limited or lacking in perfection, because it seems to just be a universal assumption of the concept of religion and the divine. So could another attribute of God be not being finite? Yes, but it's, again, Kobe, that's correct, but it's sort of folded into what we've already said. Greatest conceivable being carries with it all of these implications. It embodies with it being perfect in every possible way you could imagine, and not existing in reality would lack a little perfection. Let me read then. You can hear him say it himself, even though sometimes he's a little confusing. I'm going to read his words. So he says this: surely when the fool hears what I am speaking about, now he's talking about the atheist using the word fool, surely when the fool hears what I'm speaking about, namely something than which nothing greater can be thought, he understands what he hears. And what he understands is in his mind, even if he does not understand that it actually exists. Okay, now follow me here. Because it is one thing for an object to exist in the mind, and another thing to understand that an object actually exists. So when a painter plans beforehand what he is going to paint, he's talking about the case of a painter who just has an idea of a painting, but he's not yet put it to the canvas. At that point, prior to painting it, it's just in his head. Okay, so he says when a painter plans beforehand what he's going to paint, he has the painting in his mind, but he does not yet think that it actually exists because he has not yet executed it. But then when he has actually painted it, then he both has it in his mind, he can think about it wherever, and it also now exists because he has made it. He's actually painted it and put it into the world. So even the fool, he says, is forced to agree that something than which nothing greater can be thought exists in the mind, since he can think about it and he understands the concept when he hears it. And whatever you can think about is in your mind. So he says, at a minimum, the atheist has to concede that the idea of a greatest conceivable being is thinkable. It's something you can think about, so it's in your mind. And then he says, surely that than which a greater cannot be thought cannot exist in the mind alone. Because if it exists only in the mind, then it could be thought to exist in reality also, which would be greater. So if that than which a greater cannot be thought only existed in the mind, then that than which a greater cannot be thought is that than which a greater can be thought. But this is obviously impossible. Therefore, there is absolutely no doubt that something than which a greater cannot be thought exists both in the mind and in reality. Okay, and so that's how he gets to his conclusion that God's real and he's not just in your head, because only being in your head would be less great than being in both. And given the definition of God that he's greatest conceivable being, he would have to therefore be found in both. Otherwise, it would violate the accepted definition. So, William, basically that sounds like he is saying that God cannot exist without thought. No, God is not made up by your thoughts. Thinking of something does not make it exist. Like, for example, we didn't always know about all the planets that were in the solar system. Before we discovered Neptune, it was already there. It wasn't like the first time we looked at it with a telescope or something, then it popped into reality. So, no, not true, William. He's not saying that God cannot exist without thought. God ultimately exists. God has to exist because of the definition greatest conceivable being, and the point that it's greater for a thing to exist in the mind and in reality than just the mind by itself. If nobody existed and there were no minds to think of anything, God would still exist. It's not a subjective thing that he's talking about God being, like God is in your head, and so if he's in your head, he's in reality. No, that's not what he's saying. He's saying that the idea of God is in your head, period, and the idea is the idea of the greatest conceivable being. Then the definition takes over. If the definition of God is greatest conceivable being, he thinks that that implies that he must be real, because lacking reality would be less great. And God can't be that way based on the definition, which says greatest, not really great, but not greatest. So that's just a little bit of comment to help. But don't misunderstand it. I really want to ward you off of a false understanding. He's not saying anybody who thinks of God, God's real for them. It's nothing like that at all. He's saying the idea of God is universal to everybody. And so there's no such thing as a person who doesn't have the thought, first of all. And for all the people that do have the thought, everybody, 100% of everybody, theists and atheists, that same idea is greatest conceivable being. When you consider what greatest implies, it implies that you're perfect in every way. And existing is part of that perfection. So if you didn't really exist, you wouldn't count as the being defined in that way. Okay, now I see here below, Jim. Is existing in both the mind and reality necessarily better, simply because two is more than one? Yeah, that's one thing that could be, I guess, questioned as a way of trying to frame an objection. You could say, why is it better to exist in the mind and in reality? But I think you kind of say the answer that he would give there at the end. It's just more existence. It's more reality, right? Like, so for you right now, you want to graduate, and you think of your graduation in your mind, but it hasn't happened yet. Wouldn't it be greater for the graduation to be a thing you can think about, but it really happened in reality too? You know, the fulfillment and the realization of an idea is greater, he argues, than just having it in your mind. That's why he gave the example of the painter, right? The painter's thinking of his painting, but wouldn't it be greater if the painting was real on top of just being in his head? You know, so like Santa Claus is like a fictional character, so he's not as great as like a person that's real that would do the same thing. That's, I mean, I know I'm kind of repeating his reasoning a little bit, but that's the best I think I could do to make him seem reasonable on this point. So Sergio, he's saying, since everyone knows the concept, therefore the definition of God is absolute. Yes, it's absolute. It doesn't mean that everyone practices the same religion, but all the religions have this common denominator. God's great. And in those different religions, God is not just somewhat great, but infinitely so. That's why he's God and he's the Most High. So if that is a point of agreement, then theism of all stripes considers this to be the definition of God. And he says even atheists who don't believe in any of this stuff can understand what the word God means when other people are talking about it and when they speak it or write it. So if the definition is common currency for everybody, it means something. The definition greatest conceivable being implies that the being is real, because lacking reality is lacking greatness. Okay? So that's the essence of his argument. Oh, now, Janice, you say, because God is defined as the greatest conceivable being, then there is no possible way that he cannot exist in reality, as that would make him less than the definition he is defined as. Correct? Yes, 100%. That is correct. That's a very good summary statement of the argument that we're looking at so far. We're going to also consider critics of this argument. You know, we're going to look at criticisms and people who find fault with it. So if you're finding fault with it, then don't worry. You're going to be served with some very good arguments that kind of conduce to your view. But in one of the critical responses, the guy summarizes Anselm's argument, and this is on page 17. We'll get back into his work after I finish with everything in Anselm, but I think he gives a very clear summary of the argument, and so I'm going to read it one time so that you can kind of put all these pieces together. The proslogian says that God's existence is proved. First, because the very one who denies or doubts it already has it in his mind, since when he hears it spoken of, he understands what is said. And further, because what he understands is necessarily such that it exists not only in the mind, but also in reality. And this is proven by the fact that it is greater to exist both in the mind and in reality than in the mind alone. Because if this same being exists in the mind alone, anything that existed also in reality would be greater than this being. And thus, that which is greater than everything would be less than something and would not be greater than everything, which is a contradiction. Therefore, it is necessarily the case that that which is greater than everything, being already proven to exist in the mind, should exist not only in the mind, but also in reality, since otherwise it would not be greater than everything. Okay, so just another way of putting it clearly in a succinct statement. Now, in my opinion, if Anselm had just cut it there and stopped, I think it would have made his argument appear even stronger. But for better or worse, he goes even a stage further than this, and he tries to make an additional assertion after attempting this first basic proof that God exists. So how he expands on it from there on the next following page is that he says, on top of that God has to exist based on his definition, he cannot even be thought not to exist. Okay, now that's a little bit of a tricky piece of language, so I'm going to write it down and we'll talk about that. Okay, so also, and this is his second main claim in his writing, also God cannot be thought to not exist. Okay, so there's a lot of like double negatives and stuff in there, but we'll make sure we can clearly understand that. He's saying now that in addition to God being proven by means of this definition that he has to exist in reality and the mind, it also follows furthermore that he cannot even be thought to not exist. Okay? So if a being can be thought to not exist, Anselm is saying that that means it's less great and less perfect than a being that can't be thought to not exist. So God is defined as the greatest conceivable being, right? And if he's the greatest conceivable being, then he can't have any flaws or imperfections or lack anything. But a being that can be thought not to exist is to that extent flawed. Like, take this as an example. I exist, and you all know that. But as sad as it is, I can imagine and sometimes do contemplate possible situations in where I would not exist any longer. You know, so like, I mean, life doesn't go on forever. So I can clearly imagine a situation where I don't exist. So I can think of myself as not existing. Like, that's possible. I can imagine the world of 200 years from now with me just gone. But he's saying that God, because he's defined as the greatest conceivable being, could not be thought of in that way. So for God, unlike me and you and everything else, it's not even possible to think that he does not exist. Okay, so that's something extra. It's one thing to say I've proven God exists in reality. It's another thing to say, and furthermore, It's not even possible to think otherwise. To think that God doesn't exist, no, that's not possible, because he's too great for that. He's too perfect for that. If you could think he didn't exist, that would bring him down from his utter perfection a little bit. So that's impossible. Do you understand his statement here? It's like, it's not possible to think of him not existing. So the following thought, God doesn't exist. He says, nobody can think that. That is not even possible to think. And the reason he gives is, again, similar to the reason he gave in the beginning of the argument, because given God's definition as greatest conceivable being, it would debunk him from the position of greatest conceivable being if he could be thought to not exist. So someone in the comment right now, I want to make sure that you can actually say this, or at least write it. He says to us, what? That God is so great that what? Let me know. Let me know if you can just restate this one time. The current point that's being discussed by me to you from the lecture, from the book. God is defined as the greatest conceivable being. And because of that, what does he say follows? We're on to the second point here. Not just that he exists in the mind and in reality, but this thing about thought. So if you can somehow try and articulate this in a sentence. Anselm says that God is so great that he has to exist. Well, not exactly, Janice, because, again, that he has to exist is what we've already discussed in part 1. God is so great that you can't imagine him not existing. That's correct, Jesus. So it's a subtle difference. Both things are true, Janice. Yes, he's tried to already make the point that God has to exist in reality because that's greater than just existing in the mind. But beyond that, he also says you can't even think that he doesn't. Never mind that he must exist, but you can't even think that he does not, because if you could, that would make him imperfect too. Okay, Kobe, God is so conceived as the greatest all-powerful being that he can't even be thought not. Well, there's two nots, so you should just have one. Thought not of existing, because it would disprove his original definition of being a God, of being the greatest. That's the thing. It would remove some degree of greatness. Mark, God is so great that one cannot even be. Okay, so I saw that one. Naaman, God is so great, so the concept of him not existing would take away from his greatness. Good. Jim, since God is the greatest conceivable being, implying that anyone doesn't believe him in the existence would in turn make him less great. Okay, good. Yeah. Now I'll read it from him after I've tried to explain it in my own words. And was it Spencer, I thought? I can't remember, but Agent. If his perfection relies on our belief, then what makes that perfection to begin with? Well, it doesn't necessarily say that it relies on our belief. It's like an objective concept. Like, I mean, the sun is just out there and it's floating in the sky, and we rotate around it, right? The planet Earth. So it would be like the same thing. Like there's something in the world, there's something that exists, and we have an idea and an understanding of it. I believe the sun exists, and I believe things about the sun, but I'm not just making it up in my head. It's a real thing. So he would deny, I think, your premise that that his perfection relies on our belief. The attributes of God are what they are, and God pre-exists the existence of human beings according to Scripture and according to most religious traditions. So how can you say that his perfection relies on our belief if he exists perfectly before we even exist to have any beliefs? Is it then an assumption? Well, he says, no, it's a concept of greatness. I mean, there's like a hierarchy of great beings you can think of in your mind. All you have to do is have the idea of greater than or lesser than. And if you start associating beings along these lines with being greater than or lesser than each other, like maybe we're greater than the animals because we're smarter than them. And there could be higher beings that are greater than us because they live longer than us. And there could be even higher beings than that don't even have any limitations. It's just, once you have like some idea of a continuum along which beings are more or less great, once you start thinking of what's at the far end of that continuum, at the absolute, extreme, he thinks that's what leads you to the idea of God. It's not me or religion or anybody telling you that. It's someone who just sits back and thinks in the abstract. How great could a thing be? So I mean, that's basically what he would say, I believe. I'm channeling him, speaking in his voice for a minute. But I'm going to read a little bit more. And Sergio, yeah, that's a fair point. It is all based on a definition. But, I'm not necessarily totally in agreement with his argument, of course. It's my job to present it. But in trying to speak in favor of the author's idea, just to play, God's advocate, I guess, in this case, he thinks that the definition is common currency to all people and that it's not something that we just stipulate or make up. But anyway, let me read then. Here's what he says on this point, and try to follow it even though it's a little confusing in the wording. It says, certainly, this being so truly exists that it cannot be even thought not to exist. Because something can be thought to exist that cannot be thought not to exist. And this is greater than that which can be thought not to exist. So, if that than which a greater cannot be thought can be thought not to exist, then that than which a greater cannot be thought is not the same as that than which a greater cannot be thought, which is absurd. Something than which a greater cannot be thought exists so truly then that it cannot be even thought not to exist. And then he speaks to God for a minute. He says, and you, Lord God, are this being. You exist so truly, Lord God, that you cannot even be thought not to. And this is as it should be, because if some intelligence could think of something better than you, the creature would be above the creator and would judge the creator, and that is totally absurd. In fact, everything else there is except you alone can be thought of as not existing. You alone, then, of all things, most truly exist, and therefore of all things possess existence to the highest degree, because anything else does not exist as truly and so possesses existence to a lesser degree. Why, then, did the fool say in his heart there is no God, when it is so evident to any rational mind that you of all things exist to the highest degree? Why indeed? Because he was stupid and a fool. Now, that's not at all the right way to talk about people who have differences of opinion on any question or religious matter, but that's the way he writes. Yeah, it was a little confusing, but beneath all the jargon and vocabulary there, he's simply saying this. If God could be thought not to exist, he wouldn't be perfect. But we already know that God's definition is greatest conceivable being. So that means that he can't be thought not to exist. Can't be thought not to. This is a weird turn of phrase. Can't be thought not to. It's impossible to think he does not exist. But that leaves one more question hanging that he has to settle, and he does in the following paragraph at the end. So let's follow it from the beginning one more time. He starts by saying, here's a definition of God. Everyone knows, greatest conceivable being. Therefore, he must exist in the mind and reality because that's greater than just the mind. Oh, and also, he can't even be thought not to exist because it's greater to not be able to be thought not to exist than to be able to be thought not to exist. So then last thing is this. What can we say about the atheists then? Because atheists describe themselves as people who believe there is no God. And Anselm has just said in his argument that that's not even possible, that it's not possible to have the thought in your mind, I don't think there's a God. So he's saying that's impossible to think. Well, then what is an atheist thinking? Is he saying that they don't have that thought or that the atheists don't exist? Okay, well, here's how he tries to get around that little issue. He says atheists may say these words, there is no God. They may think those words in their head, like in your mind, you're thinking there's no God. But whether they're thinking or saying those words, he says, the thought they have or the statement they make does not really refer to the real God. So he says that doesn't technically count as a thought that God does not exist. It's a thought that, like God in quotes, where God takes on some different meaning, does not exist. Because he says God is too great to be thought of that way. So any attempt to have such a thought ends up being a thought of something other than God, even though it uses the same word. Okay? So like, if I say to you, check out this dog that I'm holding in my hand, I'm using the wrong word to refer to this thing. And even if every time I say or think dog, the idea of a marker pops up in my mind, I'm not using the word with the correct objective meaning that the word carries. So he says that's how atheists are when they make statements along the lines of God does not exist. Because he says in the mind of an atheist saying that, the word they're referring to, even though it sounds and looks like the ordinary word for God, it's substituting the idea of something lesser than him. And that's the only way they can have that idea that that thing doesn't exist. Because if it was a real thought about God himself, they would not be able to have such a thought in their head. Okay, so it's kind of like they think of the word, but they don't think of the real being of God. And so that's how he tries to set aside the whole concept that atheists say there's no God. He says, no, they don't. They don't really think that. They think that something doesn't exist, but they're not even thinking of God because God's too great to be thought of that way. Never mind that they think they're using the right word. They're just thinking of the wrong idea using the same word. Okay? So like, here's what he says on that. How indeed has he said in his heart what he could not think? Or how could he not think what he said in his heart, since to say in one's heart and to think are the same? But if he really both thought because he said in his heart, and did not say in his heart because he could not think, then there is not only one sense in which something is said in one's heart or thought. Now here's the key point that's a little easier to understand. In one sense, a thing is thought when the word signifying it is thought. In another sense, when the very object which the thing is understood. In the first sense, when you're just thinking about the word, in that sense, God can be thought not to exist, but not in the second sense, when you're thinking of the actual thing. No one, understanding what God is, can think that God does not exist, even though he may say those words in his heart, either with no meaning or with a different meaning, because God is that than which nothing greater can be thought, and whoever really understands this understands clearly that this same being so exists that not even in your thoughts can it not exist. Thus, whoever understands that God exists in this way cannot think of him as not existing. And then he closes by saying, I give thanks, Lord, I give thanks to you, since what I believed before through your gift, I now understand through your illumination. And there he closes his argument. So, and let me see if there's other questions here. Yeah, he left an opening with an irrational mind, perhaps. Yeah, maybe he thinks there are some people that are irrational, and so you can't really reason with them. But to the rational audience, they will understand the force of his argument. Yeah. You ask about a group chat. That's on you guys. I don't know. Jesus. So basically, they use God, but their way of using the word does not correspond with the definition. So it's not. He tries to have it both ways in a sense. There's a problem in my mind, though, with this last point that he made, and it exposes in my thinking like a little contradiction in his argument. Because if you go back to the beginning, remember he starts the whole thing by saying everyone has the same idea of God, right? Atheist, theist, it doesn't matter. We all understand at least this much, that God is defined as the greatest conceivable being. But then later in the same paper, he's saying, oh, but when atheists say there's no God, they must not have the right idea in their minds. So what is it? Does the atheist have the same idea of God, or do they have some deficient idea of God? It seems like when he wants to impress upon us that the universal understanding of God is the same, he says they understand it. But then later, he has to kind of change that position a little bit because he's insisting that no one can even think that God does not exist. So these so-called atheists, they may say those words, but the words they're saying don't actually mean what they think it means because they don't even have the right idea of God in their mind. So I find that to be a little tension in his thought. At some points, it seems like he says we all have the same, ground understanding of God. And in another place, it's like, well, theists understand it for sure. And atheists, some of them, if they think there's no God, then they must not understand what he is. But yeah, look, there's going to be a lot of criticisms to follow. So the next meeting is really going to be focused all on critiques of this argument. Like, what are some objections? So like if you're on the opposite side of the legal argument in a courtroom, we're going to now hear the other side speak. And we're going to show why people find fault with the argument and what the criticisms could be. So stay tuned for that, I guess. But between now and Tuesday, I guess, you have a really good weekend. I won't necessarily send an announcement like I did today to make sure you find the link for the class. Now that you've watched the YouTube live lecture, it's the same format. Just subscribe to the channel if you want and tune in at 10 a.m. every Tuesday and Thursday. And we'll just, have this little meeting and you'll be on to the rest of your day from there. So ontological argument, day 1. If you guys are all good, let me know in the chat, or you can hit the like button or something and just let me know. Yes, you always have to read all chapters that are assigned in the syllabus. So look at the syllabus, find the pages that are designated for a date, and read those pages before that date so that you're prepared when you come in. Yes, you have to read the chapter. For sure, William. I mean, there's a reason I'm giving these pages in the syllabus. You have to read those things, for your own good benefit, for your own performance in the class. Of course, I can't tell what anyone's doing in their real life, but you should read them. That's what I would hope and expect. Okay, so thanks, everyone. Have a good weekend. And don't worry, it's always going to be a little confusing, but life is confusing, isn't it, Jose? I mean, what are we even doing here? Where did the universe start? What happens after you die? Isn't it all so confusing? That's why we study philosophy. Some things aren't really clear, and that's okay. We just have to try and think harder. Okay, well, have a great day then, guys, and take care. I'll see you then after the weekend. Let me know if you need anything by email, and I'll be in touch. Okay, great. Take care.